Over 2 years ago, I set off on a mission to track down some of the largest and most insane vehicles ever made, the LeTourneau Overland Trackless Trains. These vehicles were bonkers, whatever way you cut it. They were hundreds of feet long, designed to operate in some of the most extreme environments on Earth, with crew quarters filled with more equipment than your average apartment, and even intended to one day be powered by miniature nuclear reactors. My obsession with these creations has taken me all across North America. We drove through the deserts of Arizona to see the massive TC497 in person.
I think that is original toilet paper.
We crawled through the Alaskan brush and got bitten by a lot of mosquitoes to find the last remains of the VC-22 snow freighter. Largest vehicle of its kind. The first one was good. I looked at the other one, it was fine. But I think I've saved the best for last, because we drove 12 hours non-stop from Alaska all the way to Whitehorse, capital of the Yukon Territory, to find what is perhaps the most unique and successful of all the overland trains, the LCC-1 Logistical Cargo Carrier, or as it's more commonly known, the Sno Train. There she is, the LCC-1 Sno Train. The Sno Train was the US Army's answer to long-range transport in the far Arctic North. It travelled all across Alaska, Canada and Greenland, moved supplies to the US military's secret Arctic nuclear base, and now sits here in the Yukon Transportation Museum in Whitehorse. But how did it get there? What is the story of this bizarre machine? And how did its wheels end up on the world's largest and most famous monster truck?
Monster truck, 60 minutes of non-stop monster truck action. Good. Deep in the mud. What are yours today?
Before we get started, a big thank you to our friends at Odoo for sponsoring this video and for their amazing business management platform and open source website builder. Odoo is the one-stop shop for when it comes to running, well, anything. My own shop that I run here on Rassy, my YouTube work, website building, you name it. Their extensive suite of apps covers every element of a business, from manufacturing and design to timekeeping and invoicing, and perhaps best of all, their open source website builder can help you create a beautiful website quickly and easily. I've been using Odoo's open source website builder to create a photography website for my journey tracking down the overland trains. Just being able to so easily and efficiently load in templates and designs, tweak elements, and quickly move things around seamlessly really strips away the pain of creating a website and lets you focus on being creative and tailoring the perfect site for your needs. It's helped me create a fantastic platform to show off my photography, and I'll leave a link in the description below for when it goes live so you can see my work for yourself. But really, all of this is just scratching the surface of what Odoo can do for you. So try it for yourself. The first application is free for life with unlimited hosting and support. What's more, build your own website hassle-free with Odoo's open source website builder and get free website hosting for life and a free custom domain name for an entire year. Thanks again, Odoo, and let's get back to the Sno Train.
This is the DO line, a carefully planned system of radar stations for detecting approaching enemy planes while they are far beyond our borders, stretching from the northwestern limits of Alaska, across Canada and on to Baffin Bay. This distant early warning line is being constructed by the Western Electric Company, with the help of other units of the Bell system.
In the mid-1950s, the US and Canadian military began construction of a vast line of radar stations named the DO line, designed to forewarn of a potential Soviet attack over the Arctic Circle. Stretching across thousands of miles, each of the over 60 manned stations required round-the-clock staffing, maintenance and supply. But in the deep depths of winter, when waterways were frozen and aircraft unable to fly, the military needed solutions for overland transport for these far-flung bases. And so they turned to Robert Gilmore LeTourneau. R.G. LeTourneau's company, the LeTourneau Company, had deep and extensive ties to the US military, having manufactured the vast majority of earth-moving equipment used throughout the Second World War, and now specialising in large-scale and experimental earth-moving and transportation equipment. In 1953, R.G. LeTourneau himself was invited to the North Pole by the Army Transportation Corps to offer advice on developing the vast infrastructure needed for Arctic operations, and soon LeTourneau pitched to them a possible solution that his company, funnily enough, had been developing and debuted just that year, the trackless train. With its large all-terrain tyres, a high load capacity and electric motors mounted in the hub of each wheel to provide unparalleled levels of traction and mobility, LeTourneau believed that his trackless train design would be the perfect overland transport in the Arctic. Now look, if there's one thing that you can say about the RG LeTourneau company, it's that they were prolific. They were developing and innovating a lot of stuff, and trying to keep track of the timeline of the overland trains and their development can be quite confusing. And that's why I've created this, a very easy to follow, very sane, definitely not deranged, chart of all the various overland trains and how their development led eventually to the LCC-1 Sno Train. Now, in 1953, RG LeTourneau develops and eventually debuts in 1954 the original Tourneau train. Now, at the same time that the LeTourneau company was developing the first Tourneau trains, they were also in talks with the US Army's TTTT. TTTT was the Transport and Research Development Command, looking into ways to better maximise infrastructure and overland transport up in Greenland and around the Dew stations. Now, interestingly, the representative who came from TTTT to talk to the LeTourneau company about wheeled overland transport in the Arctic was none other than Dr. Thomas Poulter. Now, if you recognise that name, it's because he is the man who developed and invented the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Now, if you don't know anything about the Antarctic Snow Cruiser, I already made a video about it a long time ago, but basically this was developed in 1939 as the ultimate overland transport in Antarctica. It featured huge, massive wheels, internal crew compartments, and an electric drive system, and it was a massive failure. Dr. Thomas Poulter's involvement in this is a very interesting connection, and it led to the development of not an overland train, but the snow buggy. Now, the snow buggy is not strictly an overland train, but it definitely falls into the realm of the overland train because it features very familiar wheels, a same steering and electric drive system, and it was actually developed and shipped out to Greenland in 1954 and successfully used out there for transportation tests for TTTT. Now, around the same time that all of this was happening, another party approached RG LeTourneau with the idea of commissioning a large overland vehicle for the Arctic, and that was Al Ghezi of Alaska Freight Lines. Alaska Freight Lines had won a massive contract to move supplies up north for the construction of the Dew stations, and the US Army and RG LeTourneau sort of convinced Al Ghezi to invest in the Snow Freighter, or the VC-22. Now, the Snow Freighter was constructed at a breakneck pace, and it was shipped up to Alaska and used successfully for a couple of the supply runs to the Arctic North. But, famously, it caught fire and is now still abandoned up there in the Arctic, and I went to visit it in my last video. But around the time that all of this was going on, the US Army was still interested in commissioning their own overland train from the LeTourneau company, but something that combined all of these elements into one. Obviously the pulling power and the electric motors of the original Tourneau train concept, the crew accommodations and the Arctic weatherproofing of the VC-22 Snow Freighter, and combining the large oversized wheels which had been successfully trialled and tested on the snow buggy out in Greenland. So what do you get when you combine the Tourneau train with the Snow Freighter with the snow buggy? Well, you get the LCC-1 Sno Train. So here it is, the LCC-1 Sno Train. Although it went under various different names by the Army and the government and the LeTourneau company who built it, but probably, I would say, one, the most successful of all the overland trains, and probably the most unique. You can see where the train name came from, because compared to the TC497 and the Sno Freighter, it has a much thinner body that is kind of between the two wheels rather than sitting on top. And it does resemble at the front there, certainly much more of a train car. It has just the one windscreen there with, well, it would have been two wipers in the past. And then you would have had a small control station. There was three very unique looking bucket seats in there with the very simple LeTourneau controls. And then at the back, a small sleeping compartment for the crew. There would have been up to 3-4 crew. It could have operated just by one driver. And then probably most unique to the Sno Train, you can see at the top there, is the bubble dome, the navigational dome that could be used for navigating by stars if you were out in the wilderness. Interestingly, if you go and watch my video on the Kharkovchanka, the Soviet Antarctic exploration vehicle, it has almost the identical bubble dome on it. Something that is used often on aircraft as well too, so that you could navigate by the stars. There was at one point a radar dome, a radar array that was built on the top of that too, but it's no longer fitted. It was probably stripped before the thing was sold for surplus. But you can see the mechanical running gear in here. Remember, of course, the big thing with LeTourneau vehicles, each of these wheels was powered by its own independent motor, housed here in the axle. But one of the things about LeTourneau motors is they were fully waterproof, dustproof, mudproof. These axle housings weren't waterproof or dustproof. The actual motors themselves in there could be submerged in water or mud and would operate just fine. So very robust and relatively speaking reliable. The kind of unreliable nature of these machines came from the fact that they were bespoke, and finding spare parts for a machine like this, especially something like the tires, if one of them burst or broke, was not very easy. Now, as we move back here, you can see this is the engine compartment. Remember, in the Sno Freighter, what happened is the engine compartment caught fire, and it caught fire because of a problem with the fuel line. Now, in that Sno Freighter, you could move from the little control cab to the engine bay just through a little doorway. In this, it was completely separated. I don't know if they did that in response to what happened with the Sno Freighter, because there's a lot of crossover when these were built. But here you would have had a single Cummins diesel engine that produced, I think it was 600 horsepower. You would have your generators, and then the generators would have fed DC electric current to all of the different wheel motors across all the different wheels and trailers. So at the back here, it looks quite complicated, but this actually is very similar to the setup on the TC497, the final iteration that was built down in Yuma. Mainly, of course, being this, the huge crane at the back. Now, this thing served two functions. It could be used for loading or unloading cargo, incredibly useful when you consider the weights and the amount of cargo each of these trailers could carry, but also it could be used for changing the wheels, and that would be very important if you burst a tire or you had to apply snow chains or the like when you were out in the field. You know, I have now seen probably more of these overland trains than any person on Earth, but the size of these wheels and tires never ceases to amaze. They are absolutely huge. Now, these wheels and tires were basically the same as those found on the TC497. Now, you can actually see on the tires here, 48 by 68 Firestone. They made all the tires for the various LeTourneau products. But if you want to know the difference between a TC497 wheel and a Sno Train wheel, the best thing to look at is these. These here are little discs that would be used for attaching the hooks for snow chains that could be used out in the field. Now, on the TC497, they used hooks, whereas on the Sno Train, they used discs. It's not foolproof because actually some of the wheels here have hooks as well too. But famously, these vehicles were later used, or at least the wheels were later used, to create the original Bigfoot monster trucks, very famous monster trucks in the US. And if you're ever looking close at those, keep an eye on these points here. If they have discs, then they probably came from the Sno Train. If they had hooks, then they probably came from the TC497. Hey everybody, Callum in the edit bay here. Look, we're about 12 hours away from this video going live, so I don't have much time, but I wanted to record a bit more because I've become a bit obsessed with where Bigfoot got its wheels. Bigfoot is probably the most famous series or family of monster trucks ever made, and they basically kicked off the craze for monster trucks in the USA. Now, Bigfoot 5 debuted, I think, in 1986, and it featured these massive oversized wheels that clearly came from a LeTourneau overland train. Now, as I mentioned in this video, the trick is to look at the hooks or the attachment points for snow chains. If you look closely at most photos and videos of Bigfoot 5, it looks like they have hooks on them, which would lead you to believe that the TC497 or the wheels from the TC497 trailers must have ended up on Bigfoot. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that. As we were driving from Fairbanks to Whitehorse on this journey to film this, I stumbled across another trailer that had the same wheels as the TC497. It was outside a kind of kids theme park called Muckluckland. Now, this was right on the border between Alaska and Canada, and this thing was not a LeTourneau trailer. It was not a powered trailer with motors in the hubs of the wheels. This was a freewheeling trailer that was made by a third party. It was manufactured by a different trailer company using LeTourneau wheels, but just designed to be towed behind caterpillars or tractors or diggers and the like. Now, it's interesting that the trailer, the Richardson trailer, I believe, that I found at Muckluckland just randomly as we were driving across the border, it also has hooks on it. So it could be that Bigfoot 5 used old surplus wheels taken from one of these trailers, or it could have been that they got them from the TC497. Now, a viewer got in contact with me a few weeks ago. I believe their name's Renee, and they sent me a link to an old documentary on Bigfoot where Bob Chandler, the kind of inventor of the truck, talks about where they acquired the wheels from.
Well, currently on Bigfoot 5, we run tires that came from an Alaskan land train, something that the U.S. Army had in late 1950s, I believe. I was doing a show in Seattle about 5 years ago, and I went to a military junkyard between two shows. I couldn't believe that there was such a tire this way, this big of a tire. But we bought the 4 tires and ended up buying 4 more from him 6 months later for $700 apiece. So I think I've got the only 8 with wheels in the country.
If I had to put my money on it, the Bigfoot 5 wheels came from a TC497, or they came from one of those Richardson trailers that I spotted outside Muckluckland. But there's one more wrinkle to all this. There's just one more thing. And that is the fact that at some point they made a replica of Bigfoot 5 because Bigfoot 5 was so famous with its gigantic oversized wheels. And if you look at photos of that one, it has wheels which have discs on them. The same discs that you'll find on the original LCC1 Sno Train. So the replica, for some reason, of Bigfoot 5 uses wheels from the LCC1 Sno Train, or at least that's my theory. You can just make out the plate, LeTourneau Sno Train powered cargo car, VS1 5271. I found a similar plaque on the Snow Freighter, and it was labelled the LeTourneau Snow Freighter, and I think it was labelled the VC22. But it's amazing seeing these original plates still on this, designating what it is. And it's interesting that they designated it the Sno Train. I think the Army called it the LCC1, it was called the X1 at some point. You can see on various labels around this thing, it's called the T80 in some places. So I think it seemed to go through a dizzying number of different names and designations over the years. But that's at least what the LeTourneau company called it when they built it. Interesting here, though, it says, a unit of Sno Train 5273 12-ply tire and wheel assembly. I had read that the tires on this were thinner on the control car than on the trailers. And that caused quite a lot of problems because these were, well, according to that thing, 12-ply. The back were 20 or 30-ply. And the issue all came down to this, the snow plow. This was actually added on later. It's not actually an original addition to the Sno Train. You can see in old photos that it was supplied and built without it. The reason it was fitted is because they were finding in Greenland, where it was operating, that the snow was bunching up and building against the back axle, as you can see there, or the front axle rather, the steering axle. And this was making it hard for it to move. What they ended up doing was fitting this that would break up the snow, but it then caused problems because when they took it to the east coast in Canada and Alaska, where there was more tree cover, what would happen is this thing would break the trees, it would create huge amounts of splinters, and then it would actually burst the tires at the front here. Oops. So going up here, you can see this is the cargo car, the interior of the cargo car. Still in pretty good condition. You can actually see it has spare parts for the overland train in here. All that beautiful LeTourneau kind of orange-red colour as well too, still shining through. You can see some parts, I think here, of a motor hub. You can see there's some geared motors, part of the kind of step-down reduction gears that were built into all of the different wheels. And then these old crates here, probably the original crates that have been sitting in there since this thing was placed into the surplus yard, where it stayed for years before the Yukon Transportation Museum took it over. You know, I've seen a lot of LeTourneau overland trains now, but this is by far the longest, because you can see the control car over here, and then you can see all the trailers stretching all the way into the back here. The Sno Freighter still has 2 trailers attached to it, but you could barely move with all the overgrown brush around it. And the TC497, there's none of the trailers left down there at Yuma. It's just the control car on its own. So it's actually fantastic seeing it like this with the trailers, because it really gives you a sense of the scale, the size of not just the wheels and the equipment, but the length of this thing as it stretches all the way back here into the distance. The Army Transportation Corps officially accepted the Sno Train from the LeTourneau company on the 9th of January 1956, and by May it was on its way to Greenland, where it was to be trialled and tested at the sub-zero temperatures around Camp Tuto and the Thule Air Base. It proved to be a capable and useful mode of heavy transport, and was often used to move supplies to the nearby Camp Century. Century was a research base tunnelled into the Greenland ice, purportedly as a testbed for portable nuclear reactors used to power the station. However, Camp Century was also secretly a trial site for a potential launch base for intercontinental ballistic missiles that could, in theory, survive a first strike during a nuclear exchange. Over the next several years, the Sno Train would be moved around numerous times, often appearing on display to the public or being relocated to Alaska to assist in resupply missions for the Dew Line. On the 9th of June 1959, the Fairbanks Daily News Miner reported how, in the midst of a terrible snowstorm, the Sno Train had managed to save the life of a teenage boy with appendicitis. Veering off its route after receiving the distress call, it transported the very grateful boy to the nearest doctor, who was no doubt as surprised as the patient had been to suddenly see the massive overland train lumbering out of the snow to the rescue. In 1961, the Sno Train would mount another rescue mission, this time to recover the burnt-out remains of the Sno Freighter, which had been stranded in the wilderness for over half a decade. After reaching the crash site and reviving the freighter with its generators, it would take almost 2 months of travelling the outback, crossing rivers and enduring constant repairs before the two massive overland trains were limped close to the town of Dawson along the US-Canadian border, where the Sno Freighter would remain for many more years. For the Sno Train, after many years of service and travel all across the Arctic, the massive overland train was starting to show its age. A service overhaul in 1960 had in fact created more issues in the powertrain and electrics, and the exhaustive expedition to retrieve the Sno Freighter in 1961 had pushed the machine to its very limits. After sitting for several years at Fort Wainwright, Alaska, in 1964 the Sno Train was finally listed for surplus. A sale sheet from the time lists the particulars of the huge machine. Overland train, diesel-electric, wheeled, rubber-tired, Firestone tubeless, size 48 by 68, 12 pile, 16 each. Locomotive contains Cummins power plant, diesel engine and generators for lights and electric motors at each wheel. Acquisition cost $315,000. Spare parts $200,000. Estimated weight, 165,400 pounds. So eventually the Sno Train, which had faithfully served the US Army Transportation Corps for so many years across Greenland and Canada and Alaska and the like, it was sold. Now, we saw in that auction sale that it was listed, I think the original value of the overland train was $350,000, a lot of money in 1950s, 1960s dollars, plus $20,000 worth of equipment that it came with. I think in the end it sold for $10,000, which is a heck of a lot of depreciation. But it sold to a Fairbanks resident who was named Carl Peterson. Carl owned various different things, but he had scrapyards and he bought it basically as surplus equipment. I'm sure he thought he could sell off parts of the machinery and the like. But basically, from that day onwards, the Sno Train would sit in his yard. There's some amazing aerial photos of it sitting in his yard outside of Fairbanks, in a small town outside of Fairbanks called North Pole. So not the actual North Pole. But of course it was quite close to the Sno Freighter, the two sister overland trains, both basically ending up in and around the Fairbanks area. Now, it sat there for many years until Carl passed away. And eventually it actually ended up on eBay. I'm sure we've all kind of been there where you're bidding on old cameras or computers or an old project car on eBay. Imagine waking up in the morning and realizing you've accidentally bid on an overland train. But after some concern that the Sno Train would eventually just end up getting scrapped with no kind of buyer in sight, eventually, in 2010, the Yukon Transportation Museum were able to come into ownership of the overland train. And, I mean, it's incredible. We drove from Fairbanks to Whitehorse. That is basically the entire length of the Alaskan Highway. An unforgettable experience for so many reasons. I mean, the views, the nature, the sights, the history of the place. We arrived in Whitehorse, capital of Yukon, and then as you drive towards the airport, which takes up quite a large portion of Whitehorse, you suddenly spot at the side of the airport, fenced off, the Yukon Transportation Museum and the massive red overland train sitting out front. Well, I can't believe I actually made it. It was 10 hours of driving from Fairbanks, where I went to see the original Sno Freighter, to here in Whitehorse. waking up very early in the morning because of jet lag, and then coming over here to the Yukon Transportation Museum to see the Sno Train. That now makes 3 out of 3. The TC497 that I went to visit on the Yuma Proving Grounds, the original snow freighter, the VC22 that I went to see in Fairbanks, and then finally this, the Sno Train. In total, there were about 6 of these overland trains made by the LeTourneau company. The 3 most famous are the 3 that survive, though, and this one, out of all of them, was the most successful. And it's quite amazing how much of it has survived. Despite the fact they weren't the most successful things in the world, to this day, you'll still find them out here on display. For Trackless Wastes, the Trackless Train. I believe that was the opening lines from my video that I made 3 years ago now on the story and the history of the overland trains. And who would have thought that it would have kick-started an adventure across the whole of North America to find the last remains of these trackless trains. I'm actually up in my garage right now because I'm actually filming myself build this. I'll maybe upload that video whenever it's finished. But the story of the overland trains has always fascinated me so much, and that should be obvious. This is now my 4th video, probably my last video, last chapter in the story of the overland trains. But I will say, as always, if you are interested in this topic, I would highly recommend R.G. LeTourneau's Overland Trains by my friend Mark Moore. It goes into so much more detail than I could ever achieve in these videos, and it's really, really fascinating, and it's helped, obviously, in the research of this topic immensely for me. Now, another thank you has to, of course, go to my patrons, my patient wife. She's probably now seen more overland trains than any other living person aside from me, and she simply could not care less, and I respect that so much. And the other thing that I've got to say is a big thank you to the Yukon Transportation Museum, who were happy for me, a random person, to turn up at their doorstep one morning and say, hey, I've just flown from Scotland and driven 12 hours from Alaska, will you let me film your overland train? And they did. And not only do they have the overland train, they've got amazing exhibits there all through Alaskan, Canadian, Yukon history, and they've got amazing merch. They've got this amazing Sno Train cap, which looks absolutely fantastic. I think my wife got a Sno Train tea towel. They've got badges that you might have seen featured in this video, and they actually have the original operator's manual. I think I've got it here. Yeah, I had this in my truck. This is a reproduction of the original owner's manual or operator's manual for the LeTourneau LCC1 Sno Train. And it's amazing. There's amazing stuff in there. I think what I'll maybe do is an exclusive video on my Patreon page to look through this, and I'll use some of the extra footage that we never got a chance to use in this video from my time filming with the Sno Train. On the topic of filming, I've also got to say a thanks to Brandon. Brandon lives near Whitehorse, and he saw that I was in the area on my Instagram, instagram.com/CallumRassie, and he was like, hey, do you want a hand filming? And he turned up, helped me film, and we got an amazing photo looking like the front cover of like a Discovery Channel documentary about 2 guys who like specialize in recovering gigantic old vehicles from the Canadian outback or something. But big thank you to you, Brandon. Now I am going to read my copy of Amtrak Wars and plan my next video. So thanks very much for watching, everyone. Bye-bye.